Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this year's Guernsey Private Wealth Forum in association with our media partner, the Financial Times. My name is Rupert Pleasant. I'm the Chief Executive of Guernsey Finance, the agency responsible for promoting Guernsey's thriving financial services industry. It's great to be here today to connect you with and perhaps introduce you to Guernsey, a jurisdiction with more than 5 decades experience as a leading international finance centre and recognised globally as a pioneer in the private wealth industry. Today's events will explore the themes of From Startup to Legacy, building and preserving wealth, examining how we can support wealth creation and protect it for the next generation. The wealth management landscape has evolved exponentially in the last 2 decades. Emerging industries such as technology, sport, social media, influencers, and new forms of entertainment have redefined what it means to be an entrepreneur, and a whole new avenues of wealth generation have been paved as a result. Throughout this forum, you will hear specialist service providers discuss the progress that Guernsey's private wealth industry has made in meeting the demand for more complex solutions. Guernsey's trust and fiduciary expertise and talent for innovation offer the ideal environment through which to manage wealth and investments. Thanks to our robust legal system and flexibility within our regulatory framework, we have a full range of structures available to facilitate the smooth management of investments and transference of intergenerational wealth. In Guernsey, we know that innovation and growth go hand in hand, which is why earlier this year, the Guernsey Financial Services Commission revised the Guernsey Private Investment Fund regime, or PIF for short, creating a streamlined, innovative private fund regime for qualifying private investors with a strong focus on corporate governance, including managing conflicts of interest. Qualifying private investors can include professional investors, experienced investors, knowledgeable employees, high net worth investors, UK professional clients, EU professional clients, US accredited investors, and licensee warranted investors. From today, the GFSC are also releasing updates to the family PIF, which is tailored to high net worth individuals, providing a family wealth solution with the benefits of a collective investment scheme structure. This may be highly advantageous to families using Guernsey traditional fiduciary structures who may wish to benefit from a regulated fund structure within their own family. These changes will make it easier for fiduciary firms to administer family private investment funds. These updates to the PIF and family PIF underpins the GFSC's ongoing work to reduce regulatory barriers, enable innovation, and help ensure Guernsey remains a leading jurisdiction in private wealth management. We believe these kinds of advancements to be a vital aspect of preserving wealth for the future, empowering the next generation to take a vested interest in their assets. The breadth and depth of products and services that Guernsey offers reflects a sophisticated approach to financial planning that modern high net worth individuals and their families demand. We respect our clients' right to privacy and remain committed to full international standards, all while providing a safe, secure, and stable domicile with close proximity to London and the United Kingdom for families and individuals to manage their wealth, investments, and charitable endeavours. There'll be plenty of opportunities to learn more about Guernsey and what we have to offer, and our Guernsey professionals, many of are who him today, will answer any questions that you may have. We'll soon be diving straight into the panel sessions moderated by a good friend of Guernsey Finance, Paul Hodgson, an independent fiduciary consultant and commissioner to the GFSC with more than 35 years of experience of financial services. For our first panel on the topic of building wealth, we're pleased to welcome panellists Tom Hibbert, a multi-asset strategist at Canaccord Wealth, Alexander Joshi, who is head of behavioural finance at Barclays Private Bank, Alice Russell, who's a portfolio manager at Cazenove, and Juliet Young, who is a partner at Schillings. Following a break in the afternoon, we will move on to our second panel session, focused on preserving wealth, for which we can look forward to hearing from Gillian Browning, Deputy Director General of the Guernsey Financial Services Commission, Edward Emblem, who is a partner at the S&W Group, Kerry Letitia, Guernsey Head of Hyvern and Chair of the Guernsey Association of Trustees, and Helen McGee, who is a partner at Joseph Haig Aronson and Bremen LLP. And as our special guest this afternoon, we are delighted to have Deborah Meaden and Jamie Lang here to participate in a Founders Fireside Chat a little later on. They are both wealth owners and wealth creators in their own right, as well as keen investors. Both are familiar household names. Deborah is a successful businesswoman whose entrepreneurial career began in her teens, creating several successful leisure and retail businesses before she joined the Dragon's Den and the Big Green Money Show. Jamie, who rose to fame on the TV show Made in Chelsea, has built his own successful business, including the confectionery brand Candy Kittens, as well as a highly successful career in media. I'm very much looking forward to hearing them discuss their entrepreneurial experiences in establishing and investing in businesses, and also their views on just how we can embrace the next generation of wealth creators in the current terrain of wealth management. There'll also be a chance for you to pose your questions to both Deborah and Jamie near the end of the session. I would very much like to thank our legacy sponsor, the Beauvoir Group, for making this fireside possible. After a few final words from me, you can enjoy some of Jamie's delicious Candy Kittens and a live band at the drinks reception downstairs, while you have a chance to discuss the day's events and make some new connections, hopefully. We're very grateful to the Fork Group, our heritage sponsor, for this valuable contribution. So without further ado, I'd like to extend our gratitude to all of you here today and our speakers. I really hope you enjoy the event and you get a very worthwhile experience. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Paul Hodgson, who will be moderating the sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rupert. Could I invite my panelists to join me on the stage, please? Well, while they're grabbing their seats, I just thought I'd point out that whilst I do my very best to cryogenically preserve myself by ice bathing almost every day, what I'm not regularly doing is working with the kind of wealth generating clients that my fellow panelists are dealing with on a day-for-day basis. Alex, in particular, is dealing with the kind of psychology of these group of people and their behavioral psychology in terms of their wealth generation and preservation. Alice is dealing as a specialist in the relationship management side of this particular group. Juliet deals with the non-financial risks, the reputational risks in particular. And Tom deals with the investment side of things in terms of strategy and asset allocation. The panel will hopefully, through the course of the next half an hour or so, cover topics including supporting entrepreneurs through this earning phase whilst allowing the individual to focus on their career, ensuring that their arrangements and support networks are appropriate, discussions with families with regards to best practice in protecting wealth, with particular emphasis on ensuring financial success for a life after a potentially short but high-earning career, changing demographics and pathways of beneficiaries, more women becoming wealth holders from generational wealth, and the avenues for inherited wealth shifting from family legacy businesses, and finally, enabling inheritors to pursue personal and professional aims while protecting wealth and preventing erosion for other beneficiaries. Just to kick us off, Alex, if I turn to you and just ask, in terms of understanding your client is a key part of any professional relationship, what are the key attributes that these young wealth creators in new and emerging industries, such as new media, and how do their behavioural traits set them apart from what we might have had more experience of in the past?
Sure. Hi all, good to be here. I think a caveat before I answer the question, which is that obviously we are all individuals. Everyone has their own unique story, view on risk, etc., different experiences. So I think that's one point is that we're all unique, right? But there are useful differences that's worth understanding. Now, I sit within the investments part of our business, so I'm primarily helping our clients, once they've made their wealth in terms of protecting, growing it on an investment journey. So what I'm looking at is the client's view on risk and return, the sort of decisions that they're making within their business, their view on the world, to give me sort of clues and signs about what they're going to be like when they start investing, to get a bit of a sense there. I think there are a few things which stand out, which are useful to point out. I think the first one is view on risk, in the sense of a willingness to take risk, especially if you're in some of these new industries. You've taken, in many cases, a big leap. Just as important is a degree of comfort with uncertainty. I think one of the biggest issues when it comes to an investment journey is dealing with the uncertainty of markets and things going on in the world, etc. And I think if you've had a lot of experience with uncertainty in your own entrepreneurial endeavors, that's going to be very useful. So it's worth understanding how some of these people are navigating that. I think when it comes to return, like if we're thinking later on down the line in terms of investment return, what is someone's views on return? If you have created wealth very quickly at an early stage in your life, you're in many cases going to have a very different view on what is a good return later on down the line when you think about investments, portfolios, etc. Decision making, I think that's another thing that's worth pointing out there. In many cases, many of these clients are going to be used to very quick decision making, having a high degree of autonomy. That's going to be something that's going to be quite important later on down the line in terms of how comfortable are you delegating decision making to others, putting trust in a team, when actually in the early stages to create your wealth, it was a lot of individual decision making, in many cases based on gut feel, etc. Those things are worth pointing out. And also communication style. I think that is just as important. How you're used to communicating with others, with your team, within your business, etc. Those things also will be very important further down the line. So from the perspective of that individual, I think there are quite significant differences there that are worth pointing out, but also obviously the environment in which they are building their business, making these decisions, is very different to many others. So that's, again, something useful to be thinking about.
Thank you very much, mate. Alice, in terms of younger wealth inheritors and beneficiaries often look to carve their own path and step away from the family history, if you like, in some ways. Why is it important, and how can wealth be redeployed to other family members to take ownership of wealth decisions?
So I think the way that we look at it is we one absolutely acknowledges that there's a huge wealth transfer happening. I think it's like $80 trillion that's going to be moving to generations over the next 20 years, to millennials, Gen X, Gen Z even. So the values of that client and that generation is really different to the current holders and capital holders of wealth. And the way that we split it and look at it is you've got the wealth inheritors and the wealth creators. So they're different, but their purpose when it comes to capital and capital management is very different to how it is now. So as a generation in general, they're more curious. They want to feel more empowered, to make good decisions. They're more interested. We were talking a bit earlier about how people are interested to be able to help manage it themselves. So to help that generation kind of act on that, but whilst at the same time, protecting it, we talk a lot with our clients about it's a big question, what's all your wealth for? What do you want it to do for you? But then also, do you want your future generations to be beneficiaries of that wealth, or do you want them to be custodians of it? As I'm sure we hear as well, we hear a lot of they want to be a custodian of that wealth. So it's our job as advisors to really work with the current kind of matriarch, patriarch, and the next generation to put the right things in place to make sure that each kind of level of generation. Each person's goals are being met in their own way, and that there's enough flexibility and engagement to be able to let that happen.
Excellent. Tom, building a financial legacy might not be at the forefront of a wealth generator's mind at the outset, but how do you feel that the right team around them can help them to effectively build something that's going to last a lifetime and beyond?
I think the support function that a team plays is the most important role that they really have. It's holding a client's hands through the short-term volatility that is inherent to building wealth over the long term. So the great thing about equities is that the longer you're invested, the less risky that they become. So over 1 year, you often generate a negative return from the equity market. Over 5 years, you sometimes generate a negative return. Over 10 years, it's pretty rare. And over 20, it's extraordinarily rare. So the longer you're invested, the rarer the better your return outcomes. And it's very important that the team make sure that the client is comfortable during those moments. And just to give you an anecdotal evidence, so in the depths of COVID, I was at I think it was the night before lockdown. I was at a social engagement, and it's Chatham House rules, hopefully. So, before lockdown, and I met someone I'd never spoken to before, and he said, "I can't take it anymore. I've capitulated. I've thrown in the towel." And I said to him, everything has got 20, 25% cheaper. Now is the worst time to be selling the market. Markets do recover. And I think that is the most important role that an investment manager has, making sure that the short-term volatility, it can be ridden through back to the long-term attractive returns that equities offer.
That makes perfect sense. Juliet, when we're talking about wealth creators, we're including a group of people for whom social media and profile are inherent characteristics of the way in which they're making their money. But clearly that brings a whole new set of risks that come with that. How can you advise us in terms of your decades of experience managing their reputation whilst ensuring that they feel empowered?
And particularly around cancel culture, I think.
100%.
Yeah. It's ironic, isn't it? On the one hand, the very platforms that help an entrepreneur to build their brand can then very quickly turn around and become the sort of courtroom of public opinion. And obviously nothing fuels a story like watching somebody being pulled from their pedestal. So the first point is that clients will be judged on their handling of their response to any cancellation as much as what is being alleged in the first place. So good communications advice is a must. But the key to weathering the storm is really about the preparation you do in advance. And there's a lot more that you can do than you think. So there are 3 pieces of prep that you can do. The first is know your vulnerabilities. Do a regular digital audit of what's out there. In particular, people are looking for examples of hypocrisy. What views have you left or espoused on Twitter? What photos exist online? Did you use derogatory terms and in what context? So you can start to get ahead of that. Secondly, keep track of the media. Media monitoring isn't just Google alerts anymore. It's got a lot more sophisticated in terms of mapping, reach and proliferation. So it's really important to identify when a story is sort of going nowhere in an echo chamber and when it's actually gaining traction. Third, know your key stakeholders. Make sure you've got a list of investors, bankers, clients on speed dial that you can communicate with quickly if something like this happens. If your client is cancelled, you need to understand the investigations as quickly and forensically as possible, because you can't begin to inform a response strategy or start issuing rebuttals or contextualizing allegations until you have that information. And in terms of what statements to make and to who, that will be very much guided by that preparatory work that I just talked about. To give an illustration of this, we had a client, a young female entrepreneur who was cancelled, and it could have been an existential threat to her business, but we followed that sort of 3-step process. We issued rebuttals. We had a very key stakeholder management strategy in place, and she came through the crisis, and we met with her some months later to get her reflections on what the process had been like. And she said, it was a really difficult time, but it was also a really good leadership test, and that, she learned an awful lot from it. And she feels that she's come out stronger for it as a business owner. So I think the key point is, no matter how daunting it may seem, with the right advice, it can be managed.
Absolutely. I think advice is clearly key. One interesting characteristic that we're obviously talking about here is that we're talking about people who are themselves much younger than might have been the case in terms of wealth management conversations in the past. Alex, how does that age difference kind of translate into the sort of psychological challenges, and how should we as advisors be helping them to navigate that?
I think it's very challenging. Sorry, I got distracted thinking about what would happen if I got cancelled. Quite a scary thought. Quite a scary thought. I think it's very challenging for a multitude of reasons. Because if we think about, obviously we're currently talking on a panel about the building wealth stage, right? But if we think about later on when it comes to the protecting wealth stage, many of the important elements of that, of patience, time in the market, diversification, all of those things. In many cases, many of these wealth owners have done the complete opposite of that, and to great success, right? In the sense of quick decision making, going all in, taking a lot of risk, and it's paid off massively, right? And so to some degree, you are later going to be trying to change someone's worldview that got formed through that wealth building process. So I think it's important to recognize that it's actually a pretty complex situation on a multitude of different reasons. Because one of the things is from a behavioral perspective, we all have behavioral biases that affect us to varying degrees when it comes to decision making, and these can be exacerbated by emotions, etc. And so obviously managing your biases, having an awareness of them, becomes very important through life. But in many cases, these biases can actually be exacerbated because of the success at a young age, in the sense of, illusion of control, and how good you are at decision making, and overconfidence, etc. Many of these things can actually be exacerbated because of the success, and so that leads to issues further down the line. And also, I think it's important to recognize that as you go through stages in life, you have certain experiences that teach you many things, right? And we were talking about it before the panel started, in terms of, many people in this room, at some point you've been frustrated that promotion hasn't happened in your career, and a pay rise, and the patience, and having to work hard, etc. Going through other stages of heartbreak, of bereavement, marriage, kids, etc. You gain a lot of experience through those stages of life, which help very much in terms of managing wealth and making these decisions. And in many cases, people have short-circuited, have passed all of that. And that leads to many, many issues, in the sense of issues of, your own identity, etc. We historically have had lots of conversations about the downsides of a successful business exit, in the sense of, someone's built a successful business over many, many years, decades, sell out, and then they're a bit lost. What do we do? And then we have lots of these conversations. Well, imagine having that in your mid-20s. I think that's very, very difficult, right? So I think it's important to recognize that lots of challenges get created by creating wealth at a young age, and it's important to try and understand them. And I think the key part of all of this is just being empathetic and understanding this, and recognizing that it can be quite alienating if we are dismissive of certain things. So, for example, I speak at many different client events and panels talking about investing. And in particular, when I'm speaking to younger audiences, I get questions about cryptocurrencies and what are you guys doing, and are they in the portfolios, etc. And I think there's a risk of being very dismissive and saying, actually, we don't hold it, it's not in the portfolio, we think this is risky, etc. You can alienate someone, especially if you're already seen as from this kind of old-fashioned industry, etc. So I, in those cases, will typically say, it's not in our portfolio, we've done analysis, it doesn't work from a risk-return perspective. But I'll make an important point, which is we've got quants that have looked at it, they think about the allocations to show that actually, we are paying attention to what's important, we're thinking about it. So being understanding and empathetic of all of those challenges is important.
No, that makes perfect sense. And in terms of the non-financial risks, Juliet, one interesting characteristic is clearly that these wealth creators are generally very, very knowledgeable within their own industry. But they will then be encouraged to effectively lend their reputation to somebody else for financial upside. And quite often that will seem like a no-brainer. But it brings with it these other kind of risks in terms of reputational risks of association. How would you kind of ask that people think about that?
Yeah, and Alex, you touched on the sort of short circuit of decision making. I mean, we see this quite frequently, and it's tough because it can call into question the entrepreneur's judgment and leadership. And obviously, there are countless examples of celebrities where allegations have surfaced, and then brand partners have had to make a decision on whether they've aligned or distanced themselves from that person in a time of crisis. The first way that advisors can help is by encouraging wealth creators to do their due diligence, or even doing it on their behalf if they have the relationship and authority to do that. Bringing to the client's attention information about the prospective partner's track record or evidence of misconduct, and that may get the client to think twice about aligning with the personal brand in the first place. In any case, investigative due diligence on a prospective business partner is always a good investment, because it's not only going to provide information about the risks, but also about the opportunities. And if the client is still keen on pursuing the relationship, you can use the due diligence to put things like legal safeguards in place. Secondly, clients still need to maintain that clear, discoverable online presence that clearly articulates their own brand and values, independent of any association, because that's going to provide a degree of resilience should a situation arise. Now, if the partnership already exists and something goes wrong, then you're going to need to understand the facts quickly, but you want to avoid as much as possible taking a public position until you do have a full grasp of those facts. Because obviously, if you're seen to be alienating that person and then the allegations turn out to be wrong, it will look like you're not dependable and you sort of run for the exit at the first sign of trouble, which is then going to impact other future brand partnerships. So in most cases, you may be able to say that you're still evaluating or investigating the situation. So this is particularly important currently in the age of AI, where an allegation may be a deep fake or have been, completely false. And we recently had a case where an executive appeared to have made some very provocative statements about the situation in Gaza. And that was causing a lot of consternation amongst his stakeholders. We were able to prove, to debunk it and show that it was fake. And his stakeholders had fortunately given him the benefit of the doubt and the time to do that. Obviously, if the allegations are true, then you want to encourage clients to be, open about the situation, take responsibility, and then where appropriate, demonstrate corrective actions, like stepping away from the relationship, which will obviously be much easier to do if you've done your due diligence and you have sort of put in those contractual clauses and so forth in the first place.
Alice, picking up on those kind of very practical steps, where you're the relationship manager and holding these relationships with people who have these kind of brand partnerships, how do you see the challenges in terms of relationship management and trying to allow them to exploit the things that make sense and not to do the things that actually are potentially really problematic for them?
I think we have to accept that our role by looking at my role, and I think ours as advisors, but our role is changing as the wealth inheritors change, the generations change, the wealth creators change, because our role isn't just, especially from a wealth management point of view, it's not just risk return anymore. It's not just let me manage your portfolio and make you some money. I used the phrase earlier, and I actually hate it, I can't find a better one, but we call ourselves a financial quarterback. And that's what I think our role is now, not just managing that. It's making sure that your client is best looked after by pulling different people in to make sure they have the most high quality advice. Because we all know, we all preach how much everyone needs high quality advice. but we've got to accept that this generation that we're talking about and this economy that we're talking about is very new. What we've seen, what I've seen, is they don't have the right advice around them because, you know, they're very young. We've already identified that, so they might not know what kind of advice they need. They, you know, aren't from kind of traditional wealth creation paths, so they might not be our professionals in the city that have friends and lawyers and understand and hear about it. They're growing up in a completely different economy. So if you do have a client in that situation, or you do have a client in this new economy, in this new age, you've got to kind of accept that you have a kind of duty as well to, one, educate them and make sure that they are asking the right questions, but two, make sure we're bringing the right people in and challenging them if they do want to make the wrong decision. You know, there's nothing wrong with challenging somebody or challenging somebody on an accountant. You know, they've had. I have a client that made a lot of money through OnlyFans overnight, loads of money. This was a long time ago, but they had an accountant that their own tax return, and then had an accountant kind of went next door, and basically the advice they got was really bad, and now it's coming to bite them. So it just kind of shows that if you educate well and bring the right people in front of them, essentially, the client should have a better outcome, and ultimately that's what we want for our long-term relationships and for the client's benefit as well.
Brilliant. Tom, in terms of asset allocation and strategy, every client has different values, different generations may have a common set of principles. How important is it to help young clients understand their investment methodology, and how do you ensure alignment with their values generally?
So first and foremost, I mean, younger clients tend to have a higher equity content, so a higher risk tolerance. They're investing for a longer period of time, effectively. And I think what Alice said, she used the key word education. I often think, I mean, she sort of described the ongoing process of managing a client, but it's often the first meeting that is the most important and determines the longevity of that client relationship. Because it's a process of education that works both ways. For you need to understand what the client's investment objectives are and what their risk tolerance is, and whether there's any other sort of other goals that they want to invest, any tramlines that they have. But for the clients, you need to ensure that you effectively explain the strategy that you're going to use to employ their investment objectives. And if they understand that, then you can explain the outcomes that you achieve if you employ that strategy. So that two-way effective communication and understanding and education is absolutely key in making a client feel comfortable with the outcomes that they eventually receive.
Brilliant. And in terms of changes around the new generation of wealth generators and building wealth, Alice, as a woman in this industry, how can your own experiences help you to support young women inheriting and generating wealth?
It's a very relevant question, because there's a lot of data that wealth, especially within the UK, is really moving towards women. I think at the end of this year, it's supposed to be 60% of wealth is to be owned by women. So it's a changing time. And again, those women are made up not just from inheritors, from intergenerational transfer, but also creators. And typically, and Alex, you're much more qualified to answer this than me, but I know, women are more risk averse in general. It's a historical thing, and because we're less risky, we've got to think about more things. But I think, again, as an advisor, education is the biggest part of it, and challenge and asking questions. If you're an advisor advising a young woman who is going into business or wanting to, inheriting wealth, let them ask you questions that you might not think, probe them to ask why, ask why back, because we, as women, they ask less questions, they're more happy staying in status quo, not making changes, not taking as much risk, not starting that business because they're worried about potentially, what happens if I want to have children and need maternity cover. So as an advisor, kind of think, these are the things that are going through that person's head, and how can I help kind of facilitate them to be able to make the best decision for clients. So the maternity thing, for example, you open that question, talk to them about it. Let's put some funds aside for that so that you can be equipped to make those decisions.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Alex, how would you kind of add to that in terms of your background as a behavioural psychologist?
So I'm going to disagree with you slightly on the response there. Going back to the initial point I made about the fact that every individual has their own unique story and we need to understand them, I would come back to that here, because if we think about, for example, cohort of women investors, I think in lots of reports, articles, etc., there comes the headline of being more risk averse when it comes to investing. But actually, I think in many cases, the picture is far more nuanced than that, in the sense of done quite a lot of work on this and trying to understand this. And in many cases, one of the things that comes out is actually the bar of confidence that needs to be crossed to be comfortable with making an investment decision, in many cases is higher for women than it is for men. And then that, to most people, it comes across as more risk averse. But actually, it's a far more nuanced picture than that. It's a need for more understanding about the products, about the strategy, etc. And once that bar is crossed, then actually, in many cases, risk tolerance could be higher, right? There's a difference between tolerance and degrees of composure and general financial personality. And so to Tom's point here of, we've got to speak about an understanding of what's the individual's goals and what is their risk tolerance, but also understanding beyond that, actually, their whole financial personality, if that's the term that we want to use here, to get a bit more of an understanding about composure and all of these other things which play a big part. So I think from my perspective, when it comes to whether it's women, whether it's next gen, etc., is just a better, deeper understanding of the individual and recognizing that actually in many cases the thing that needs to be solved is actually an issue of communication, more so than products and approach, etc. Because I think in many cases as an industry we try and solve things by having a new product or a new solution, etc. But actually sometimes it's just speaking about things in a different way. When I'm in conversations with next-gen clients, I talk about investing and investing principles very differently than I would with someone that is far older. And in many cases, I'm talking about the same product, the same approach to investing, but actually with one case, I might be talking more holistically about goals, values, what do you want to achieve in your life, etc. It might still point down to the same investment portfolio, but it's a very different conversation to talking about risk and return, which is what historically as an industry we've done. So client centricity is the summary point.
Folks, we're just coming up to the kind of end of our allotted 30 minutes. Do any of you have any particular comments that you'd like to highlight or emphasize? I think to Rupert's point about Guernsey and its connection to this subject matter generally, I'd obviously emphasize the fact that, as a jurisdiction, we have all of the characteristics that this particular group would want to access, service providers, stability, all of the other sort of functional characteristics. But are there any particular points that you'd like to highlight before we wrap up?
I mean, I think Rupert said in his introduction more eloquently than I certainly could, but Guernsey has always played a presence throughout my career in finance. And obviously, Rupert, as he said, half a century of building that private client dominance, and it's very much deserves that place. So, thank you.
Brilliant.
What I found actually is this generation, they're more curious and also they're much more fluid, and that is geographically fluid as well. And also what we also find is from content creators, sports entertainers, what comes of being more fluid where you live is your wealth can be created in other places. So actually having different jurisdictions to be able to domicile wealth and having the flexibility of educating clients about their options with assets has worked quite well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's really important to also take that global view because, reputation is global now, and particularly with the developments in generative AI, stakeholders are consuming information in a very different way. We're no longer kind of necessarily looking at hits on Google line by line. We're asking a question and we're getting a digest which is curated by AI. So, yeah, really important to kind of take that global view.
Fantastic.
And I think what I'll say is that, as human beings, we struggle a lot in thinking about what our future selves will be like, what we'll want, what our view on the world is, or what our decisions are, etc. So I think all of us have a huge amount of expertise and a lot of value that we can provide. These young people creating this wealth, I think in many cases it just requires a bit of thinking about how we package that up, how we sell what we do, the expertise, the value that we can provide, because the world is changing, the way that wealth is being created is changing. But actually, the key principles of growing wealth, preserving it, passing on to the next generation, those things haven't changed. It just sometimes requires just a bit of imagination about how you sell that.
That's a very good segue into the session after the break on preserving wealth. So with that, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking my panelists for a very interesting session. Thank you very much indeed.